Guys, this is Andrew with SHTF Honey Badger here, and I'm going to be talking to you about how to use two-way radios in an emergency. Two-way radio communications, after all, is one of the best tools to have in any prepper's toolbox in an SHTF situation. While I previously have talked about off-grid communication equipment setups, I haven't really touched too much on how you actually should be conducting yourself on the radio, and that is, to be honest, about as important. So personally, I've spent years using two-way radios, and to me it's something that's just kind of ingrained into myself, but I do understand for people that aren't used to it, it's something you kind of need a little bit of an idea on how to actually use. So that's what I'm going to be talking about more. The first thing is, with two-way radios, you should be sticking to the ABCs of communication. Those ABCs are going to be accuracy, brevity, and clarity. It's a two-way radio, not a cell phone. They're not really for conversations, they're for communications, and you need to start compartmentalizing the two and viewing them differently. When you're using this radio, you're not using this radio to BS with people about the weather. You're not using this radio, if you're running guard duty, so to speak, to just chit-chat back and forth. You're going to be using this radio to communicate important information. And you need to be communicating that information clearly, and you need to be communicating that information accurately. A good example of this is going to be if you're communicating with someone on how to meet at a specific location. You don't want to sit there and provide a lengthy, vague description to someone. You don't want to tell them, well, meet me over, a couple 100 feet next to the red barn down the road across the creek at yada yada yada's place. You want to be able to get on the radio and say, hey, so-and-so to so-and-so, I need you to meet me at the intersection of County Road P and County Road 34 in 15 minutes. Plain and simple, that's accurate. That is as brief as that transmission can be based off what's being said, and that's clear. Now, my personal experience working as a boots-on-the-ground individual out there in the field with the radio, as well as working behind a radio at a desk as a dispatcher sometimes on shifts, was that people typically messed up on the accuracy sometimes, the brevity of their transmissions often, and the clarity just as often. And the thing is, missing any one of those three is going to cause a problem. If you're giving an inaccurate description, people are not going to find you or not respond to the right location when something happens. If your transmission's very lengthy, you may be interrupting other radio traffic. So for example, if you're calling out because you see something suspicious while you're out there protecting your community and you're trying to communicate that back to your prepping group, but then you start rambling off a bunch of stuff that's not necessary, you could be preventing people from within your community communicating and figuring out where they're going to meet up to go and confront what they need to confront, or to ensure that they're plugging holes around their defenses. So having that brevity in your transmissions is important as well, so you're keeping those airways open as much as possible. And the clarity is the biggest issue that I always have seen, especially when people get stressed or a traumatic situation occurs. So with that clarity, that would mean no matter what the situation is, try to take a second if you can, take a quick breath, and calm down. You don't want to get on the radio and be the guy on the radio screaming something out there, because the reality is it's not going to come across clear and it's not going to come across brief. It's going to come across as a 5-year-old with an air horn holding the button down on the radio, and nobody's going to understand what you're saying or what's going on. So you need to make sure you're doing everything you can before you transmit to be calm and to speak clearly into the radio. And that's going to be kind of our 3 basis points that I want everybody to remember when it comes to using two-way radio communications. The next thing is going to be determining what you're saying on the radio when it comes to codes or special languages. So when it comes to radio communications as well, and you see this in law enforcement, you see this in the military, you see specific codes that are used, or you see phrases that are used that mean something different. So a popular example you'll see is a lot of law enforcement agencies out there use 10 codes. You also see this in some off-roading communities where they use some variations of 10 codes, or you'll see this in the trucking community using variations of 10 codes. But having pre-established codes when you're communicating within your community is important. Now, it may not be a laundry list or an encyclopedia-sized book that has to have codes in it. It may just be a few simple ones, but something where if you need to communicate to somebody, hey, meet me here, or hey, this is what's going on, you can say it without other people that may be listening in that you don't want to hear to be able to understand it. Because keep in mind, most radios you're going to be using in SHTF situations aren't encrypted, which means if you do have bad guys out there and that's what you're communicating about defending yourself from, it's very possible they may have a radio and be listening in on your traffic. So in those situations, that's where, for example, having a code that says meet me here, or we have a suspicious thing in this direction, would be important. So instead of you getting on the radio and alerting them that you're aware of their presence and saying, hey, I have a group of suspicious people approaching from this direction towards the gate, for example, you may be on the radio and say, hey, I have a 1017 at this location, and that's going to help so they understand that, hey, the people within your community know what's going on, but the people out there don't. Another thing with this is call signs. Call signs aren't always going to be necessary, especially the smaller community you have, because it's relatively easy to go on the radio and say, hey, Andrew to John, or Bill to Robert, and use radio communication just using names. That's what you do see common in a lot of places now, but if you do have situations where you're running into several people with the same names, for example, having call signs that you use on the radios could be something beneficial and something I would want you to think about beforehand. That way, if you ever are in that situation and stuff's going south fast, you can just hop on the radio, call out to your buddy using the call sign, and you don't have 3 people named Robert trying to hit you back on the radio, because if they try to do that, they're all going to be walking on each other. It's going to clog up that channel. It's going against our ABCs of communications at that point. So call signs may or may not be important. It's something to consider in your group, though. And the final factor that I really want to bring up when you're talking about inside of your own group communicating is going to be codes for specific locations. So you may not, for example, want to be on the radio telling people to meet you at a certain address or telling people to meet you at a certain landmark on the radio, as, again, other people may be able to hear those transmissions and they may not be friendly individuals that hear those transmissions in those type of situations. So you may want to have certain designated landmarks or locations that's utilized by the individuals within your community as code words. So instead of saying, for example, so-and-so's house, or giving an address, you may simply be able to say, hey, we're meeting at location Charlie. And everybody in your group understands what that means, but people on the outside do not. So that's one thing I really wanted to bring up, as well as you need to have some ideas on those communication networks within your group for what you're going to be using when you're talking to each other. But then on the flip side of that, the other thing I do want to point out as well is when you are speaking to people outside of your community. So if you ever do happen to be in a situation and you're getting in contact with someone outside of your own prepping community, plain English is always going to be best on the radio. That's what you'll hear that kind of referred to in the law enforcement world, for example. A lot of agencies veered away from 10 codes just because it took a lot to learn, so they call it plain English, and that's what I'm going to call it here as well. And with plain English, it simply means you on the radio talking, not using 10 codes, not using any, short language, so to speak. You're simply stating, hey, here's what's going on, or hey, meet me here. And that's the only type of time you would use it, though, would be if it's an outside party you're communicating with. Because again, you don't want outside parties to know about your own internal movements or your own strategies if you can avoid it. But those would be kind of the items I would bring up with radio communications that I want you guys to think about. And it's something that's relatively easy to practice as well. You don't even need to have the radios turned on and be using them. You can literally sit in the room with people bullshitting and start talking back and forth and communicate like you're using the radios. And if you're doing it that way, it's going to give you a little bit of practice, and it's going to give you an idea on how to conduct yourself. Because again, remember, you want your transmissions to fit within that accuracy, brevity, and clarity of communication. And once you get used to that, it's going to definitely help you use those radios and excel more in those situations and ensure that you're using them to their full capability. Now, that's what I want to touch on you here today. If you have any questions, you have comments, concerns, your own experiences or input, definitely drop those all down in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. And while you're on your way down there, the subscribe button's right there, like button's right there. If you don't mind, tap it. Most of all, though, stay safe, stay prepared.